Hi everyone, my name is Keris and I am a master's student in Terrorism, Security and Society in the Department of War Studies at King's College London. I will be focusing this podcast episode on post-conflict Syria following the fall of the Assad regime, but particularly focusing on the current and growing threat the Islamic State poses to the region despite the collapse of the Caliphate in 2019. In this podcast, I will share why I chose to write about this, the key points of the article, what the process of researching the article was like, and my final thoughts. Before focusing on the content of the article, I would like to talk a bit first about why I'm interested in this topic, and more importantly, why I am looking at it from a human needs perspective. Looking at highly complicated political topics from this perspective has interested me because it highlights the ongoing struggle faced by many communities following the end of a conflict. This research process has highlighted this, but it has also highlighted that it is something that tends to be neglected by mainstream media. Writing a piece of journalism from this perspective has allowed me to understand and advocate for those who are sometimes voiceless. During my degree, I have had the opportunity to explore the rise and fall of ISIS in the region, where I have had the chance to hear from experts in the field. However, I have not had the opportunity to explore what happened after their defeat. That is why this internship was appealing to me, as I believed I could build on the knowledge I had already gained, and writing the article would allow me to delve deeper into this ever-important issue. Moving on, my article is titled, "As a fragmented Syria struggles to take shape, the shadowy threat of ISIS is re-emerging." My primary aim was to delve into the lingering presence of the Islamic State in Syria following the collapse of the Assad regime in 2024. I sought to highlight the challenges faced by the de facto government in the aftermath and the current threat posed to civilians. It is now important to provide context about ISIS. ISIS, or the Islamic State, emerged in the early 2000s with its origins in Al-Qaeda following the security vacuum in the region following the US invasion of Iraq. The group broke away seeking to exploit the instability in the region. By 2013, it was seizing territory in Syria, and by 2014, it had effectively overrun the Syrian government. It went on to declare a global caliphate in which IS claimed religious and political authority over the Muslim world. For the next 5 years, the group would control a region the size of England, subjecting 12 million people to a rigid interpretation of Sharia law, committing mass atrocities and displacing millions of Syrians. However, this came to an end in 2019 after the US Global Coalition Against Daesh spent 5 years reclaiming IS-controlled regions. Eventually, the final stronghold fell in 2019. Now, it is important to provide some context of the Syrian civil war, arguably the backdrop in which ISIS operated in. Since 2011, Syria has been engaged in a brutal civil war under the rule of Assad. He was president of Syria from 2000 until his overthrow in 2024, and his father ruled Syria from 1970 until 2000. More than 500,000 people were killed and 12 million people were displaced. This period was marked by extreme censorship, executions, forced disappearances, discrimination against ethnic minorities, and extensive surveillance. December of 2024 marked a turning point when HTS, a Sunni rebel group, launched an offensive against the Assad regime. They eventually seized Damascus, forming the new de facto government, who now enjoys majority control over the region and enjoys popular support. However, despite the fall of the Assad regime, the situation remains unstable, as those who stormed Damascus have a complex history, making reconstruction potentially difficult. I start the article by exploring the socio-political and economic barriers that continue to hinder the recovery of the highly fragmented region. One of the biggest problems facing Syria today is economic reconstruction, as poverty levels are currently at 90% across the region. The 9th Syria Conference pledged €2.5 billion. However, this is conditional on the pledge that the human rights of all ethnic minorities are safeguarded. However, in the first few months of 2025, the legitimacy of the de facto government has been questioned due to the steady increase of sectarian violence, as it is estimated that 1,400 civilians have been killed. These civilians are believed to belong to the Alawite community, a minority religious offshoot of Shia Islam. This is the community that Assad belonged to and ultimately enjoyed disproportionate influence in his government. Recent armed clashes between Sunni Islamist forces and the insurgent fighters that are still loyal to the disposed regime are highlighting the ethnic division still present from the decades of brutal authoritarianism. However, as this interim government struggles for authority nationwide, these remote, poorly governed regions are becoming fertile breeding grounds for ISIS to exploit and regroup with relative ease. I then focused the article on the sharp escalation of attacks in the region, which are posing a severe risk to human security and safety. Despite the collapse of the Caliphate, it is estimated that 3,000 active fighters remain. The group has been forced to go underground, transforming into a decentralized insurgent group. Furnished with fresh supplies of weapons abandoned by Assad's army stocks, the group has been able to intensify their operations quickly. For example, in 2023, they were responsible for 200 attacks, killing over 500 civilians and soldiers. However, by 2024, this number tripled with more than 750 deaths across the region. ISIS is seeking to rebrand themselves, and one way of doing so is targeting the generation of ISIS fighters which are currently being held in detention camps in northern Syria. It is estimated that 75% of those in these camps are still deeply committed to the ideology of the Islamic State, and as a result, these camps are becoming increasingly vulnerable to radicalization and recruitment. The early indoctrination of these young male soldiers have made them an integral part of the future fighting force, and as a result, there has been a steady increase in the number of attacks against these detention centres. Now, moving on to what I learned from the research process. Before I began writing the article, undertaking the journalism courses proved imperative to developing my journalistic skills. I found the course What Makes a Story Strong fascinating. Here I learned that to explore broad but also very complex issues facing society, it is important to find a compelling story with powerful characters, as these stories are arguably best told through the lives of the people that have experienced it. This would ultimately allow the audience to relate and identify with the character, which would be more likely to capture their attention. This is something I sought to capture in my article. So, for example, when examining the recent attacks in the region, I sought to tell them from the perspective of those involved. Telling the stories of those killed in battles against ISIS or by ISIS-affiliated attacks by their family members who are not only being targeted but are also experiencing high levels of grief and trauma by the hands of ISIS allows the audience to connect and engage. This would make the reader not think with their head but watch with their heart, and this is ultimately where impact and change happens. My main takeaway from the experience is that while the defeat of ISIS marked a historic moment in the fight against terrorism, it is now clear that this enduring defeat is not assured. The current problems facing the de facto Syrian government following the collapse of the Assad regime is only going to make preventing an ISIS resurgence more difficult. However, when covering this issue, it is important to focus on it from a human needs perspective, as it is clear to see that ISIS is regrouping, but most importantly, the civilian death toll is rising. In conclusion, I am extremely grateful for this opportunity, as I believe it has developed my skills to write not only academically, but also to ensure that when writing from a journalistic viewpoint, my story is engaging and compelling to suit the audience type. For example, in this case, to write for a Gen Z audience. I hope that you have enjoyed learning about this topic, as I thoroughly have, and thank you for listening to this podcast.